How does it feel to go psychotic? Well, it's not pleasant, and I think it can be honestly pretty hard to tell that anything is wrong at all or that anything is changing in you because one of the symptoms of psychosis is anosognosia. Anosognosia? I don't think I've ever said that out loud, but basically, it is a symptom that causes you to lose awareness of what's happening to you, like you lose awareness of all your other symptoms. So to you, nothing's really wrong, but everything is heightened. I can only really tell what it was like going into psychosis now that I've come out of psychosis, and I can look back on those memories, and now with the knowledge that I have, say, okay, that looks like a symptom. That looks like something that was going into psychosis. There's a prodromal phase, which is basically the first stage. There's 3 stages. There's prodromal, acute, and recovery phases of psychosis, which are basically the incline going into psychosis. The acute phase is like the break or the most heightened part of psychosis, and the recovery phase is what it takes to come out of it. So I'm really just going to focus on the prodromal phase because that's the phase that I've gained the most insight into so that I've been able to navigate staying out of episodes. And for me, it starts with negative symptoms. Negative symptoms are not like super clearly defined in the DSM. They're just listed as negative symptoms, but they're typically like becoming withdrawn from social activities or the people around you, isolating, not taking care of your personal hygiene, depression. For me, school avoidance. I stopped going to my classes entirely. It's basically just like closing in on yourself. Then I'd say what came after that for me is what I just like to consider psychotic thinking. Just thinking in general in ways that are disordered, ways that are kind of questioning reality before I actually stop believing in reality. For me, I would think of things like, how does gas work? Like, how did people discover that there's oil under the ground, and how did they know to refine it into gasoline, and how did we transport it to gas stations and have it put in these pumps so that people can put it in their cars? And what's the deal with cars anyway? What's the deal with engines? Who thought of that? Where did all of these inventions come from? How does modern society operate? It goes even further from there into, why can't I see through air? Why can't I see air? How does matter work? Why can't I put my hand through a wall? Why is it that when I get my hand wet, the water clings to my skin until it dries? I just question everything. And then I think what I start to actually notice is when the paranoia creeps in and I start fixating on thoughts of people following me or people spying on me. It's when the delusions kind of present themselves, but very subtly, so that I'm not quite like lost in it yet, but I am like, okay, why do I feel so weird? Like, why do I feel so sketched out? Why is it that I think there are people following me when I don't see anyone there? Like, why do I feel so scared all the time? I also tend to start wandering. I don't know if this is true of everyone, but when I'm psychotic, I will wander. Like you'd hear about people with dementia commonly wander. I do that too. And I'll just take off and I will go for miles until something or someone stops me, usually the police. And the wandering kind of starts before I've even had a break, where I find myself walking and then losing track of where I'm going and then taking really weird routes to get where I'm going. And it takes me like twice or 3 times as long just to get home from some place because I've been wandering and losing track of my mind. And finally, I start to have really pressured speech. I tend to be very excitable, animated. I become very hyper. And this is when I typically actually notice distinctly that something is changing in me. And I usually think to myself, I think I'm going manic. I think I'm manic and I should probably see a doctor. I should probably schedule an appointment to see my doctor. And it comes on so quickly after the mania that within like a week of having the thought that I should get help, I already am in a break and it's too far too gone, and I have lost the opportunity to get help because I am no longer in reality. And the crazy thing is, once I'm in a psychotic break, that's when I start to think I'm normal again, actually. Like, I think to myself, these situations are not normal, and people are not acting normal, and my environment is not normal. Everything around me is going crazy, but I'm fine. I'm me. I am as me as I've ever been. This is the most me I've ever been. And I truly believe that all of the chaos is coming from outside of me and not from me. And I think that's why hallucinations and delusions feel so real, is because they're external to me and I am still myself. So anyway, that's kind of what it feels like, at least for me, when I'm going through the prodromal phase of psychosis and when I first come into an episode. It's different for everyone, but I think there's a lot of similarities. And I would love to hear your experience. What has it been like for you? Because I love hearing from you guys. Let me tell you about the time that I nearly drowned and how that relates to my view of people with psychosis who become violent. When I was a little kid, I went to a summer camp where my mom was a lifeguard. And there was another summer camp that shared the campus with our camp. And this camp was called Camp Red Leaf. And it was a summer camp for adults with developmental disabilities. So at the end of the camp day, when all of the kids from my camp would go home on the buses, the Red Leaf campers would come and use the pool that my mom was lifeguarding. And I, being my mom's kid, would get to hang out with all of these people and swim along with them too. One day in the pool, there was a bit of a misunderstanding, I suppose you could say. My sister and I were splashing at each other, and a woman nearby thought that we were splashing at her. And she was very angry, and she picked us up by the backs of our necks and started dunking us in the water. She started going farther out towards the deep end, dunking us, and my sister was bigger than me, so she could keep her feet on the ground, but I was very little, so I lost my footing of the ground and I couldn't stay above air, and I began to take in water. I couldn't hold my breath, and then I just became incredibly serene and passed out. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on the pool deck, on my back, with a lifeguard sitting next to me who had performed CPR on me, and everyone had been, called out of the pool, so everyone was sitting on the deck watching, and it was scary to me, but I brushed it off pretty quick because I was a little kid, and I ended up getting back in the pool with everyone, except this time I got in with my friend Daniel from the Red Leaf camp because I liked him and he made me feel safe, and I felt okay playing with him instead of this other lady. I never felt ill will towards that woman. If I did, it was fleeting, because at a young age, I understood that there were people in my life who had different cognitive abilities than me. My parents were really good at explaining things like that so that I could understand that they didn't think the same way as me, they didn't understand the same things as me. So even though I was scared of her, and I think it's completely fair to be afraid of someone who does that to you, I never put any blame on her for what had happened, because I understood that she didn't really understand what was going on. I later found out that she was deaf and she couldn't hear us telling her our explanation for why we were splashing. None of this to say that what happened wasn't wrong, just to say that there are a lot of layers to situations like this beyond the black and white, right and wrong. So I'm not saying that it isn't wrong to commit acts of violence. I'm just saying that there can be understanding and empathy and compassion for people who have different cognitive abilities than you. Her actions towards me didn't change how I saw the developmentally disabled community. I didn't cast off an entire community based off of one negative experience with one person. I played with my friend Daniel immediately after what happened because I didn't see him for his disability. I saw him for him. So I didn't label his conduct and his character based on someone else's actions just because they had the same condition. It frustrates me when I'm trying to advocate for the safety of people with psychosis, and I'm trying to advocate that we are at a higher risk of receiving harm than causing harm, and I am met with people who lump all of us in with a negative experience they had with a person in psychosis and try to cast us all off as being violent people. We are each individuals. We are not our illness. And I'm not your boyfriend. I didn't do to you what your boyfriend did to you. And so you can't tell me I'm the dangerous one here. I'm not dangerous because of what your boyfriend did to you. Yes, there are people with psychosis who commit violent acts, just like there are people who are mentally stable who commit violent acts. And statistically, there is no difference in the rates of violence between people with psychosis and people who are mentally stable. We are just as likely as the people who are sound of mind. And even when someone with psychosis does commit a violent act, it is perfectly okay to be afraid of that. It is perfectly okay to have your feelings towards that. But understand that this person is likely just as scared, if not more so, than you are committing that act. And like I said, there can be some understanding involved instead of like blaming a person for an illness. When a person with psychosis becomes violent and it scares you or is even directed towards you, it's easy to lose sight of the person behind the illness and forget that they are experiencing a different state of cognitive ability than you are. Your feelings are very valid and it's fair to feel hurt. I'm just asking that you exercise a bit of understanding towards the situation at large. What are triggers? Triggers are essentially people, places, or things that prompt a negative psychological response when you're exposed to them. And triggers can happen for a multitude of different disorders or kinds of issues. Like you could have substance abuse triggers. If you were an alcoholic and you saw your favorite beer, that might elicit a negative response of wanting to drink again. Maybe you have an eating disorder and you have food triggers. You can have triggers from post-traumatic stress disorder. I have triggers from post-traumatic stress disorder as well as psychosis. And I think the two are very heavily related because the psychological response I have when I'm exposed to a psychosis trigger is just as crazy and severe and debilitating as the response to a post-traumatic stress disorder trigger. The PTSD triggers I have make sense. They're the kind of triggers that most people commonly would accept as triggering, and they would think that's understandable. I could see how that would be a traumatic experience for you that would absolutely affect your psyche. And this would be things like previous essays and domestic violence and childhood neglect and abuse. Those things I think are pretty understandable. But my psychosis triggers make no sense, complete nonsense. And people would never understand why these are triggering things to me. And I honestly can't explain what it is about them that's triggering because they're so weird. Like I'm heavily triggered by black socks, and I can't say why, but black socks, I can't even look at them. So when my fiance moved in with me and the first time I did laundry, I threw away all of his black socks behind his back because I simply couldn't tolerate it. And it's still something I struggle with. Black socks, of all things. It's been somewhere between 2 and 3 years since my last psychotic episode. And in these past couple of years, I've made great progress in handling my triggers and overcoming a few of them. And I think this is in part because I'm heavily bombarded by triggers every day because I'm triggered by pretty much everything. So I can't help but be surrounded by them and I can't avoid them. So that exposure therapy is forced upon me. And also, I have made an active effort to put myself in situations where I have to be confronted by triggers, which is very uncomfortable, not always successful, but does yield results. For instance, I actually did my makeup specifically for this video because everything on my face triggers me. I did glittery eyeshadow because glitter triggers me, and I've been working on that one. And I have turquoise makeup aside from that because turquoise makeup triggers me. So this is uncomfortable, but I think I look great and I'm loving it. So it's a conflicting feeling, and that's kind of the point. When I found this makeup in a box recently, it was a box I hadn't opened since my episode. And initially I wanted to recoil from it. I didn't want to look at it or touch it. I wanted to throw it away. But my immediate thought after that was, I would love to be able to wear this stuff again. I want to work to that point. So I have put an effort to take it out of the box and then put it in the bathroom and then look at it enough to want to put it on my face. It took several steps, but this is me working on my triggers. Even though I've gotten over a lot of triggers, There are still some huge ones that I don't think I'll ever get past. My biggest trigger involves going to the bathroom, and literally every single time I use the toilet, I am triggered, and I can't avoid that, but I also can't live with it. So it is a hugely distressing experience to me every time I use the bathroom. A lot of triggers are unavoidable. There's no avoiding it. There's no way around it. That doesn't mean they're any less painful. And this is one that I might always be working on. I just want to finish with one thought that kind of sparked the idea for this video about triggers. And I think it's some misinformation or like a misconception about triggers that I hear from a lot of like mentally stable people who probably don't get triggered by things like turquoise makeup and black socks. There is an idea that in theory is great, and that is the idea that people need to be accountable for their triggers and they need to own that. They can't expect other people to be responsible for their triggers or to know to accommodate them. You have to take care of that on your end. But I also think that there's some common sense involved with trigger warnings that just is like a common courtesy, you know? I think it's pretty well understood that gore cannot be handled by everyone. Not everybody enjoys seeing gore. And if you know that a lot of people are upset by that, even if you don't want to use the word triggered, but if you know there are people who don't want to see that, put a trigger warning on it. Like, you don't have to make it all on one person to take care of their own well-being when you are knowingly putting out information that disturbs people to a point that it's pretty much common knowledge. I think I'm responsible for my triggers in the sense that I don't ask people to tiptoe around me. I usually don't even tell people when I'm triggered or that I have a trigger because there's just so fucking many. There's so many, it's unavoidable. I'm just gonna have to go through life managing it on my own. And that often means that I have to leave a situation to recover, but that's on me. However, like, I don't want to see some pretty obviously triggering stuff from people who like to think that it's somehow okay to put out violent images and expect people not to have a response. That's just my 2 cents. I honestly think this mindset probably comes mostly from people who have never been triggered, so they don't know what that's like. But I do want to say going forward that if you don't know whether something's triggering or not, and you've never had that feeling yourself, just throw a trigger warning on it to be safe. Who could it hurt?